All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here at Apolloni Vineyards. It's July 30th, 2020. We're here with Kevin Green from the Randonnée wines in Apolloni. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kevin. We really appreciate this.
My pleasure.
First question, and most important question for our purposes today, is why wine?
Why wine? It's a good question. I wanted to be involved in making something that was, I guess, more important to people and brings people together, as opposed to, let's say, a tech device that is important, of course, to people's lives, but it isn't as emotionally charged or important. And so I really wanted to do that and also use all of Kevin. I'm sure one of your questions will be, what did I do before wine? This is a second career for me. So I'm also a chemical engineer. I started life as a chemical engineer, and that was very brain focused and Kevin at the keyboard kind of thing. So I wanted to get up and move around and use all of me, the whole body, and be outside a bit more.
So tell us about that, about kind of pre-wine life. What brought you down the chemical engineering path?
It's a good question. Also, good questions. Yeah. I am very analytical, and I suppose my parents might have observed that from early on and thought, oh, Kevin's going to do something engineering-like. And my dad's an economist, and I thought about studying economics or psychology as well as engineering, and his advice to me was, Kevin, get an engineering degree because you can always go back and do economics. It'd be much more difficult to go the other way around. So I started studying electrical engineering, and then eventually, like very late in college, changed to an even more difficult major and got my chemical engineering degree. So I guess it suited me and my personality, and I actually find that that's true in winemaking as well, because the more analytical, there is the art and the science, don't get me wrong, and my challenge is always to bring in the more artistic side of me to the winemaking, but I think that more consistent and ultimately better wines are made with a lot of attention to detail and a really analytical approach. So I have found that especially chemical engineering is a super good fit for winemaking.
When you made the switch, and then what was your kind of thinking in terms of what your future would be with a chemical engineering background?
I mean, I had this, I guess you'd say, naive view, because obviously engineering is something you go to school and you study, and then you're an engineer. So I had that as my my paradigm. So I figured, well, I'll go to school and get some training on, what is the application of chemistry to winemaking, and then I'll be a winemaker. As it turns out, that's not really the way that our industry works. It's a little bit more apprentice-based, as if I were becoming an electrician or something like that, which is grand. So my original idea of what was going to happen took a little bit to materialize. But what I wanted to do, as I say, is be outside more. I wanted to spend more time on my feet, moving around, and hopefully have a little bit more balanced work part of my life from that perspective. So I don't know, did I really answer the question about the history, the background?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. So as you decided that, as you kind of found how it was to enter into wine, tell me about entering into wine then. What was your first step towards becoming a winemaker?
Well, the first step, while I was working still in my previous career, was to go to school. So I spent about 3 years at Chemeketa, commuting back and forth from my home in Hillsborough, to get both the associates in viticulture and enology, because I wanted to, I wasn't sure if I want to be in the vineyard or in the winery or do both. So I spent a good long time commuting back and forth with a very supportive wife, both to say, hey, you can spend this much time and it's cool. She has the job with benefits as well. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in the transition. So I knew that I needed to get experience actually in a winery. So my first harvest was at Lejeune, and I think I'm extremely lucky to have gotten to work with both Harry and with Mike Ayers, who was the winemaker at Lejeune at the time, and would count him as a great friend, and he was a great mentor for me. And that was in 2006. So I was in the program in Chemeketa from 2006 to 2009, and started with the harvest at that point. So it was, I mean, generally speaking, it was very challenging to go from one career to the other and not be able to enter at the professional or the level of responsibility, I guess, that I had enjoyed in my previous career. So that was a challenge for me. That took some adjustment, and it meant that I was able. Well, I was fortunate that I was able to continue working as an engineer outside of harvest time, because I'm sure you've heard, and I don't know, maybe I didn't know this at the time, but hopefully everyone else does. It's easy to get a job during harvest, and it's very, very difficult to get a year-round job in the wine industry. So I did harvests in 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 before I was able to get a year-round job in the winery. So during that whole span, I was either in school and engineering, or I was harvest and engineering once the school was finished.
That's a lot.
It was a lot. Yeah, in some ways I feel like I'm still not recovered, but that's my own doing by starting my own brand, my own business, really. Yeah, I mean, I think anyone would say going to school and working full-time is a lot, and maybe I should have taken a few more years to recover from that. But Clodagh would definitely say that.
Tell me about your first impressions of harvest. Like you said, you mentioned you come from a professional background, you have a professional work, and you're thinking you're transferring into wine. What's your first impression of your kind of first harvest and the work you were doing and the industry itself?
Well, no less professional, I guess, to make sure that's clear. But my first impression was, holy mac, this is a lot of work. And that was fun. And I don't get to do as much of the physical work during harvest now as I used to, and I miss that. So it's always a challenge during harvest to carve out time for me to do the physical work instead of just managing the harvest process. But it was exciting and invigorating. And what I guess what really struck me, especially working at Chehalem, was the sense of community and how important spending time with and socializing with your coworkers at the same time harvest was going on. I think for Harry, at least I believe this is where that came from, that part of winemaking is equally important to the actual process of making wine. And I've learned, I think, a lot about myself in the process of changing my career in that regard. Like, the social interaction is equally important to me in my life. I mean, whether it's from my job or from my personal, non-work part of my life, it turns out that that's an equally important part of what makes Kevin. So that I didn't realize it at the time, but that really sort of set the stage and helped me probably decide that, yeah, I'm continuing on this path and this is where I want to be. The staff from Chehalem made lunches, I think most every week. I mean, I wasn't there for the entirety of harvest because I was still working at my other job, but it was brilliant. Really had a great time.
You mentioned that you went to Chemeketa to do both sides, enology and viticulture. You weren't sure. Tell me about the kind of what appealed to you about both sides, and what kind of eventually pushed you on the certain path.
I would say that I've kind of wound up more in the winemaking side, not because I chose that path. Yes and no. What I really wanted to do was both, and would still like to spend more time in the vineyard. Whether or not that's possible is really just a function of production level. Here at Apolloni, I've been making more wine each of the vintages that I've been here, than would allow me to really spend much time in the vineyard. So it's no problem that Alfredo and I are able to divide have this sort of natural division of labor as wine grower for Alfredo and winemaker for Kevin. It's worked out well, but Previously, when I worked at Montanore, I was a viticulturalist for a couple of years, as well as assistant winemaker. So, yeah, I would love to do both. Really, I think that comes back to another reason that I wanted to change my career, which is both my parents grew up in Iowa. Both grew up on farms. I really feel strongly about my personal connection to the land and to farming. And we used to spend a good chunk of our summers in Iowa every year as kids on my mom's family farm, and that has had a big impact on me. So I still feel a lot of affinity for farming, for farmers, for the Midwest, for that culture, which has obviously changed over the years. It's probably more, interestingly, I'd say it's more in Oregon. The farming culture here in the wine industry is probably more like the family farming culture was in the Midwest 2 generations ago. Because now most family farms are family farms. I mean, they're thousands of acres.
Right.
But when my mom grew up and my grandfather and my great-grandfather were farming, it was, they had their own cattle and their own pigs and their own chickens, and they had a few hundred acres, and that made them a living.
A true family farm.
Yeah.
True family farm. So you mentioned Montanore. Tell me about how you found yourself at Montanore and that kind of interesting dual role of being viticulturist and assistant winemaker at such an interesting place. Tell me about how you found yourself there and about kind of the role you carved out for yourself.
Okay. That was my first, working at Montanore was my first year-round full-time job, so we can, if you're interested or however this goes or whatever, we can fill in the in-between
Sure.
at some point.
Sure.
But I found myself there very fortunately, I guess. I was out sort of knocking on doors and doing some tasting. Maybe I took an afternoon off my day job or something, don't remember exactly, and I was on my way home to Hillsboro, and Montanore is close, and I thought I'm going to get one more stop in, and so I called in just before the tasting room closed. I said, this is my CV, and I am interested. I'm just looking for a job in the cellar. And the tasting room person took it back to Ben and Stephen, and who were the winemakers at the time together, and they weren't available, but had a look at the resume and got back to me.
Wow.
Just a few weeks later. So had an interview, and that was at the How. I really enjoyed working for Rudy. He, his focus on biodynamics and biodynamic winemaking is, I don't know if singular is the right word, but it's or linear. I mean, it's not a linear thing to do biodynamic farming, but his focus is keen, I guess you might say. So I really enjoyed that. I wanted to learn more about it. I would still love to learn more about it. It is, I'm sure he'll tell us, a lifetime of learning. So while there, it was Ben Thomas, Stephen Weber were the winemakers, and myself. And so I had the opportunity, I guess, to help out where the need was greatest. And so I saw a need to help Rudy out in the vineyard, and again, kind of bring a little bit more analytics to the day-to-day or the seasonal operations, and gather some more data, provide it to him, and get some more eyes in the vineyard, because at that time he was super busy selling the wine. So hopefully it was a win-win. I feel like it was. And we spent some good time together in the vineyard, and then I was helping Ben and Stephen with whatever needed to be done in the cellar. And as we tried to focus a little bit more on a few small batch winemaking projects, then again I was able to focus on the smaller macro bin sized fermentations and the barrels, and follow them all the way through.
I want to ask you more about that, but I will back up for a second before we go on. So tell me about let's fill in the in-between. So Chehalem was your first stop. Where else between there and Montanore?
I may miss a thing or two. I mean, I got to do through Chemeketa a we call it cooperative work experience. So that was required as part of the program to get the degrees, which I wanted to get, the actual associate's degrees. And so Schehalen, that was one. I think I also was able to fill that need working a little bit with Laurent and his team when they were in McMinnville. So that was like, again, CWE, it was like an afternoon a week or a day and a half a week, I think it was, for 6 weeks, something like that. So not a lot, but it was, at least wasn't during harvest, so I got to see a little bit more of the non-harvest activities. And then I worked with Scott Scholl at Rapid Ridge for a couple of harvests, and he was working or making his wine, I guess you'd say, with Dave Bruters, Carlton Cellars at the time. This is 2007 and 8 in Carlton. And I made wine in my garage, or garage, as my wife and I like to say the Irish way, in Hillsborough during that time as well, because I just wanted to practice. So I wanted to practice going and finding some fruit, talking to the grower, trying to figure out, how are we going to farm this? How much am I going to take? When are you picking? But just kind of do all the process that I could. And then I had friends helping me because I was working harvest somewhere else. And so I had to have someone do punch downs in the evening. I could do them before I left in the morning, but so that was fun, having some friends help out in the garage, and made actually not an insignificant amount of wine at home in 7, 8, 9. And then I worked also at Shea for one harvest, and at that point the advice that I had gotten was, it's great you're getting these harvests, but if you really want to get the full-time job, maybe you should go down under. You should do a Southern Hemisphere rotation, and then you could get 2 harvests in a vintage, or in a year, calendar year. So 2010 I worked at Rockburn with Malcolm Reeves Francis, and in our spring, so their harvest in New Zealand. And then that was again Mike Ayers, who comes from New Zealand, was able to help me do some networking to help find that job, so that was great. And then I worked in Burgundy in 2010. So at that time, it was great to come back that summer, and my engineering job wanted me back. I said, I'm going to paint the house this summer, and I just need a break, be home a little bit more with my wife, and before I headed off to Burgundy. So to work in Burgundy, to work in France was a dream come true. Where early Kevin sort of intersects with wine Kevin is that I studied French when I was, it was my chosen foreign language when I was going through school, and I knew I would travel to France at some stage, so I even took elective, an extra class or 2 in college at the university level, just to kind of keep it fresh enough. And I had traveled on vacation, but really I thought I want to live in France at some stage. So it was only for a few months, but it was a dream come true to be living and working in France, speaking the language, getting to know the culture better. So that was, fantastic. I'd love to do it again. So sign me up. So that was a place called Domaine Lejeune, and it's in Pommard, a small family-owned place. And this is going a little bit more in the technical direction, but they, at the time, I don't know that they do now, but at the time they did not own a destemmer. So 100%, 100% of all the wines made every year, cold, warm, didn't matter, were whole cluster.
Wow.
And that was really interesting. Totally opened my eyes. The wines were beautiful, very long-lived. And 2010 was a cool vintage there, so it was a challenge. I know it was a challenge for the family to get through it, and I think the wines turned out well. So that was 2010, and then we pick up at the end of 2010, and I'm cruising around looking for a job, and happened into to Montanore and made the acquaintance of Ben and Stephen. So that fills in the gaps, but. It was a journey, and that also means, kind of going back to the transition, I love to travel, and obviously my wife is from Ireland, so there's that history of travel, and between the two of us, for me personally, to have gone to Ireland and met her, and the Irish as a culture love traveling, and they've had to over the years. So it all fits, right? But it was difficult for Claude and I, because she has, her job is here now, and so she's working full time. So I was gone for a good chunk of 2010, and the benefit to us was she got to come to New Zealand then at the end, and we got to hire a Juicy Cruiser, a little camper van, and do 3 weeks traveling around. And then she was able to get some more time off, and my mother and my aunt rather came to the end of harvest to Burgundy, and we traveled around and met Claude in the south of France, and had a couple more weeks to travel. So great opportunities. I suppose you'd say emotionally or relationship challenging, and financially challenging too. I mean, this whole thing, for anyone starting their wine industry career, is, the pay is not great. It's difficult, challenging to get started. So, yeah, that was then. That's the history. Those were the challenges.
It's a lot of different places to have worked, a lot of different kind of philosophies to have seen. I'm curious, as you started making your own wine, what was your thought in terms of philosophy, style? Like, what did you want to make wine? What did you want your wine to be as you were making it your own?
I think, as a lot of winemakers say, and I kind of feel like it's a cliche now, but a lot of winemakers in Oregon say, well, we want to make Burgundian style wines, but really, what does that mean? And the wines in Burgundy change from vintage to vintage, just like they do here. Having lived in Burgundy and done that work, I got to, as part of the program that gave me the visa and the right to work and that sort of thing, we got to do a tremendous amount of tasting from old vintages and new vintages and different producers up and down the coast. And in my mind, in my sensory mind, I have, I'll recognize something, oh, this reminds me of Burgundy. But it's not always the same type of wine or style. But there's something kind of ethereal about it for me. And I guess, so, I want to make wines like Burgundy. What does that mean? So that's one part of it. And other than that, I purposely tried not to be too, I don't know if dogmatic is the word, but I tried not to be too set about, I really want to make wines this way. I want to use only fruit from here. I want to do things this way, because I knew that it wasn't my wine that was being made when I started in this career. It was someone else's. And so how the owner or the brand want the wines to turn out is really the driver. So I feel like for much of my career, much of my focus, that's the goal. It's to really ask the right questions, make observations about what types of wine and style that people like, that I'm either working for, or the people who are selling the wine that I'm making, or speaking with the customers and really trying to see what turns them on. We have to be true to our site, whether it was at Montanor or now Apolloni, or any of the other locations, but then make some decisions within the confines of where the fruit's from. So, I guess that's sort of the base, or set the stage. Over time, then, over the years, I thought, well, this is the wine I like, this is the style I like, and when I have the opportunity, either within the wines I was making, let's say at Montanor, I had the opportunity to work on these small batches. So I could say, well, this one I want to make a little bit more in this style because I think that's what I'd like to do. And this one a little bit more in that style because I think, oh, this block is going to show a little bit better in that way. And so it's been a real gradual sort of a thing. I think a lot of people, at least when I've heard them talk or talked to them, maybe came at it a little bit more like, I'm moving to Oregon because I'm going to make wine like this. And that's great if you're starting your own brand, but at least for me, to get started, that wasn't the case.
I'm curious about that kind of balance, because, like as you mentioned, you're making most of the wine you've made has been for someone else, has been someone else's. So tell me about, you talked about kind of observation and question. At what point do you feel that kind of confidence to be able to ask the question and then take that into practice and create a wine in the style that you think the person is asking for? How do you kind of learn that process of vineyard observation, questions of other people, and then this is the wine I'm going to create because of those factors? Does that make sense?
Almost.
So at what point do you feel the confidence to make a wine in the style that you think I'm going to appreciate as the person making the decision?
Well, I suppose to be fully confident, I'd have to make wine for you a few years and get your feedback. And I have clients that I've worked with for 7 years, I guess, or this will be the 8th vintage coming up. So I feel like I have that confidence now, and I've had it for several years. But that's not really what you're asking. I mean, at what point could I have begun talking to someone and said, oh, well, I can make you that wine. This is what you like. I think it's asking enough questions, maybe tasting some wine with the person. I mean, fortunately, most of my clients have been happy to, bring the grapes from their vineyard and say, hey, make me some great wine. And it hasn't been as, in-depth or analytical, to go back to that word, where we've sat down with a lineup of 3 vintages and 5 producers and up and down the valley and this sort of thing, and really tried to zero in. I personally, philosophically, I really feel like that would be time well spent, but the biggest difference in the Pinot Noirs that I make within a vintage or from vintage to vintage is where the fruit's from. That is ultimately the driver. And this is the terroir that we as an industry talk a lot about, and it's been made evident over the centuries in Burgundy and other places, and I think it's becoming, it is pretty evident in Oregon with all of the different parts of the valley and how different the wines are. And then within the next biggest influence is Mother Nature. So the wines this year will necessarily be different from the wines last year, and even though the growing seasons might be pretty similar, it's amazing to me every year how different the wines turn out. So philosophically, kind of circle back there, it is helpful and instructive and useful to have those conversations and to look at wines together and really try and zero in on something. But at the end of the vintage, or the end of the growing season, we're going to do our best and to make things in a certain style, but without, there's a risk of over manipulation and not having the wines be as good or be as true to the vintage and as true to what they could have been, to force things stylistically. So my philosophy is a little more hands-off, to let the wines become what they're going to become. And within the terroir and the vintage restrictions, guide the wines in a certain direction. So this has turned into a long answer.
This is an excellent answer.
But so the confidence to talk to folks and say I can make the wine is, I guess, yeah, it's okay, because I know I have so much influence and I try to impress upon people. I can do so much, but there is a limit because of the vintage, and obviously people know what the site is going to do, or hopefully they do, because that's where they're sourcing their fruit or they plant their vineyard.
Was that tough for you as an engineer to kind of be more hands-off?
Well, what's tough for me as an engineer, it's become a lot easier, but man, there are so many freaking variables in winemaking. It is unbelievable. And the number which are controllable are like infinitesimal. And I think we kid ourselves, any winemaker kids themselves, that they really think they can put their arms around a vintage and make it into what they want it to be. So it drove me nuts initially, like how, not like to the point of frustration, but just working harvest and going, man, but it's not this way, or but it's not that way, or why can't the grapes just be like this? Because then I could have done my trial and got the answer I wanted, or got the information that I was looking for. It's just not that way. And often in my mind, I've gone back to, well, gosh, what was it like for my grandfather, my great-grandfather? What was it like for a farmer whose entire livelihood, the ability of their family to survive the next winter financially, was down to farming. And so this family farm had a diverse set of crops. Maybe the animals are for eating and the crops are for selling, and so you have your cash and you have your food, but every year Mother Nature is dictating to some degree how much you get and how good it is, and then there are the economic forces that drive how much money you get for what you've farmed. So I've thought a lot about that over the years, like, man, I think it's hard. What was it like for them? And it's not that my family won't eat if the wine doesn't turn out, it's that the wines might not be as good and they'll be a lot harder to sell, and they might take a long time to work through a vintage. So just the amount of variables, it's unbelievable. And they're just not things you can control.
So what's next for you after Montanore then? What's the sort of the next step on the process there?
So that was, now it'll be 8 vintages ago, and so that was coming here to Apolloni. So at that time, I was doing a lot of thinking. I wouldn't necessarily call it soul searching, but here I was. I landed in the wine industry. I had a year-round full-time job. Was it my dream? What was different about it from my dream? What would make it closer to the dream or the goal of working in the wine industry? And as I said, I wanted to be more outside and be in the vineyard. And so I was able to work my way into those roles and get the experience. And then I realized, or what sort of the next step was, what are the 5 things in Kevin's next job that I figured, tick these boxes, or try and find a job that would meet these needs and desires. And one of those was a smaller winery, preferably family owned, that I could work directly with the owners to sort of execute the vision and the plan. Because as an engineer, I worked in a small consulting firm, but I also worked in a corporation. And at this point, working at Montanore, I could look back and see that a lot of what frustrated me about engineering wasn't necessarily the engineering, it wasn't necessarily the sitting at the computer and being, brain Kevin. It was the corporate layers and layers and how that I just really didn't feel like it suited me. So fortunately, at the time that I was kind of putting this mental list together, then I learned that Alfredo and Lorene were looking for a new winemaker, and had a conversation with Alfredo, a couple of conversations, came out to see the place, chatted with them over lunch, and just tried to learn a little bit more, and felt like, hey, this is a good fit for me, and he felt for them. So we embarked on sort of a journey together, because it's been, like I say, quite a while now. And I feel very fortunate to have found another winery in kind of my hood, so I'm not making a huge commute. Not that I have anything or would have any issue with working in other AVAs, but it's nice to be near home and to be sort of in the community where I live. And it sort of matches in a way the nascent what's my style, what kind of wines do I want to make, and that would have been a little bit more elegant, lighter, less extracted, more, cooler, of cool climate style wines. And we are here at Apolloni at the moment, and this is the north end of the North Valley, and I think we're the northernmost vineyard and winery in the Willamette Valley appellation, and so it's a challenge in a cool year, and that's great because these are the types of wines that I think in the back of my mind I wanted to make. It's more Chamboul or Moussigny or Volnay. It's not more a bigger, bolder section of the valley. Although I like those wines too. So I think that answered the question.
When you came here, what was kind of you mentioned kind of growing together. What was kind of your understanding of where Apolloni was and maybe where they wanted to be and what your role was going to be in that growth?
Good question. I mean, we didn't really talk about it in those terms. It was, it was a discussion about, well, we would like to grow the production a bit, and we have X number of acres, and we can sell some fruit or we cannot. We can buy some fruit because we do make some bigger red varietals where we buy fruit from Eastern Washington, and so it's pretty open-ended. It wasn't something that defined.
What did you, as you mentioned the location of this north of the North Valley, as you started to kind of learn the vineyard and learn the grapes here, what were your kind of impressions of what you were working with?
What were my impressions of what I was working with? I guess first it was, oh my gosh, we're making how many varietals? And then it was like, oh, that's fun. This is a great opportunity because I hadn't made wine with Merlot or Cab or Sangiovese or Nebbiolo, Viognier, Muscat. I mean, we've done all these different varietals since then, but the estate stuff is a little more than half Pinot Noir, a good chunk of Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, and Pinot Blanc. And I was really excited about the Pinot Blanc in particular because I had a real curiosity. I had really enjoyed Pinot Blancs that I had but not had the opportunity to make it. And so that was exciting, and eventually started doing some barrel fermented Chardonnay, which had been something that Stephen and I had wanted to do for several years at Montenor, but the vineyard where we were supposed to get our fruit frosted out just enough that we didn't get any because we were like the newbies contractually. So that's been a lot of fun to do that. Otherwise, I mean, it's a unique site because we kind of on this ridge north of Forest Grove, we don't get the rains don't come as early. So it's like the high pressure holds in this ridge for an extra couple of weeks pretty much every year as Oregon turns to rain, which is really fortunate because we hit our bud break and our bloom and our lag phase a week or two later than the rest of the valley. So that's really been the biggest learning, and it was, I guess you'd say like clockwork, but then I've just said that Mother Nature doesn't work that way. But it's amazingly consistent, and that was the biggest impact to me initially because I can drive from Hillsborough in the Tualatin Valley in the spring and in the summer sometimes, but really it's obvious as the weather's changing in the fall. I can be in fog and really cold temperatures there, and as soon as I start up the hill to this ridge, poof, all that cloud cover is fog or cloud cover. It's behind me, and I'm here in the sunshine, and it's the second or third or even fourth week of October, and I'm like, wow, this is tremendous.
You talked about the varietals you had never worked with, all the reds, all the different things. Tell me about the learning process of working with grapes you hadn't worked with before and sources you weren't familiar with, and kind of learning the style of working with Merlot and Sangiovese, etc.
Right. Well, I guess fortunate in a couple of different ways. Alfredo's farmed this site and made wine here and purchased many of those varietals since '99. I believe, and maybe started purchasing that fruit, some of those varietals from Eastern Washington up the gorge in 2006 or 7. So the first couple of years doing those varietals, I was happy to say, okay, what's the normal procedure? How have you typically executed this? And and just kind of row in. Because again, I've really tried not to, working for someone else and their brand, I think it's really important to be sensitive to what their vision is. What their vision is for the story, for the marketing, for the wine styles, for what varietals they want to make, all these kinds of things. So I'm the vessel, or I'm the messenger, if you will, as the winemaker, to help the Apollonis realize what it is that they want to make. And that's my job as the winemaker, for someone else or for a custom crush client. So, and I think my engineering background really helps with that, because engineers work for clients, and clients have a vision and a project. They want to build a winery, they want to plant a vineyard, they want to build a factory, whatever it might be. The engineer is there to write down the requirements. What's the goal? These are the things we need to construct. This is the timeline we're going to do it in, and then execute. So, the first couple of years was absorbing as much of that as possible. And another big help was Chuck Wagner. He was a classmate of mine at Chemeketa, fellow engineer as well. He and Alfredo have worked together since 2009 or 8, I think. So Chuck's has been here every harvest, helping out to some level, and it's been fantastic to have him. And it's been really valuable. I have valued his input and his professionalism, his help with the winemaking. Sure, last year, or I remember 3 years ago, or there was this really cold year. It must have been 2011. Oh well, and he's like all this knowledge comes out and some great ideas. Or in the first couple of years, like, okay, this is what we should do. Great, let's do it.
So you had talked earlier about making your own kind of garage wine. At what point did that become more professionalized? What point did you start your own brand?
My wife and I started Randonnée with the 2014 vintage, and that meant that because the reds that we make here at Apolloni are almost always over vintaged, so that meant that we would be bottling that in 2016. So that's when we started selling wine. How did that start? I always had in the back of my mind, it'd be fun, I'd enjoy having my own brand someday. But I hadn't sort of decided to jump at it, and we can blame David Polite, my friend at Carlton Hill Vineyard, another classmate at Chemeketa, great guy, I love him to death. And I know you've talked to him, I don't know what he said, but I should go watch. But a super character. And so Dave, thanks, gave me a ring on, let's say a Thursday in September, and said, "Kevin, you've always been bugging me to sell you some fruit." I'm like, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I finally have some for you." I was like, "That's great, but Dave, it's the middle of September." He's like, "Yeah, we're picking next Thursday." I was like, "Dave, come on." He's like, no, you and Clodagh talk it over. Give me a call on Monday. Whatever I've got, up to this amount, and whatever you guys like to do. And I had been bugging Dave for years. Like, I'd really like to make fruit from your vineyard, because we kind of went through the litany of where have I worked and whose wines have I helped make, and there, it's quite a diverse selection of parts of the valley, but there was something about Dave's wines from his vineyard that really spoke to me over the years. And it didn't matter if it was a hot year, like 6 or 9, or cool year, 10, 11. I suppose we'd tried those at that stage together. That site really speaks to me. And so Clodagh and I talked it over, and we said, well, this is the phone call that really we were waiting for, because that's the fruit that I wanted to work with. It's like, I suppose, if you were in Burgundy and a neighbor called and said, I want to sell my 2 rows of this Premier Cru vineyard in Chambon-Moussigny. Like, well, can we make some terms? Because it's going to take a few years to pay for this. And it's the phone call. So that was what launched the Randonnée, was being able to make fruit from Dave's vineyard. And then, in addition to that, was in the back of my mind. I had always thought, hey, if I ever do have my own brand, what white wine would I want to make? And when I met Clodagh in Ireland, kind of her go-to white was Sauvignon Blanc. And I thought, okay, this is not going to be easy to find, but I'd like to make some Sauvignon Blanc because that's kind of a way to honor another part of my journey into wine, which was living in Ireland, and we should talk about that at some point. And so I didn't have to think that long, fortunately, and another Dave Gruters, who he had the vineyard, Russell Gruters Vineyard, and he had Sauvignon Blanc planted, and I knew he was making some, and I just said, hey Dave, is there any chance that we could buy some fruit from you? And he was happy to oblige. Again, we'd known each other since I worked at his place in 2007, and he's another great friend and great guy. So that was La Randonnée. So the 14 Pinot, and then we made 15 Pinot, because again, that would be in barrel for a while. Having not sold it yet or gotten any feedback from people, and made some Sauvignon Blanc in 2015 as well from Dave Gruters Vineyard.
Once you make that decision and then that phone call comes and you have this, you're going to make wine under your own name. Tell me about the process then at that point of deciding on a name, deciding on a label, deciding on kind of a strategy, especially as you're making wine, still making wine for someone else as well. Tell me about kind of the process of getting La Randonnée started.
Well, it was a lot of fun to have the opportunity to think about all those things for myself. And it was also, it turned out to be a lot that I knew very little about. I mean, I had always been around the branding discussions and the marketing discussions and, of course, the winemaking and the viticulture and that kind of stuff, but I'd been around those discussions for other people for many years at that point, and so I had kind of an idea in my mind, well, I want to be careful about having a story that I can relate to, and maybe a story that other people can relate to, and one that's reflective of me personally. I mean, really, again, kind of going back to the interpersonal part of the industry, and I guess something I have learned again through the wine industry about myself is I do really like to talk to people, and I like to hear their stories, and I like to share mine if they're interested. And I like to see the light bulbs come on, and so I've kind of learned all of that about having the brand, and maybe there was a little bit of the beginning of that realization when we were setting up La Randonnée, because we sat down ourselves, we sat down with friends, we poured over lists of potential names for over glasses of wine, and it was it was pretty fun, but you're thinking, this is you got to get it right, or right enough, so it's pretty daunting. And so that was the process. How we chose La Randonnée was, I think, as anyone will admit, at least privately, you need to find a brand or a name and a story that matches you, and then you need to go make sure that that brand is available. So there were other ideas. I don't even remember how more likely they were than La Randonnée, but this was fit the story and the idea, and hopefully it's something that people relate to, and it was available. So that has to be part of, that's the necessary logistical part of it. And so for me, the story of La Randonnée, it's a word that means a walk or a trek in French. And there are two parts, you might say, to the story. And the first part is that Clodagh and I met in a hill walking club in Ireland. So hiking, hill walking, whichever culture, Randonnée describes that activity, it's very important to us, individually and together. And the other part of it, and maybe the part that's more, I guess, is more today in having this conversation, and how I or anyone else wound up in the industry here in Oregon, is that, if you were to interview friends of mine from high school, or people I grew up with, or probably my parents, no one would have said, oh, Kevin's going to be a winemaker someday. I mean, this was the farthest thing from my head, from anyone else's thought process, is just go growing up in Colorado, this was not a, it's not a career path that anyone would have thought about. Maybe they would now in Colorado, and certainly people would have it perhaps in their radar somewhere if they're growing up in Oregon. But really, my randonnée in life is a metaphor, because when it's as analytical as I am, looking back over my life when we were talking about the branding and had this wine that we were making, and was just looking back over my life, like when it came time for big decisions, including, yes, Dave, I would love to buy some fruit from your vineyard, and put it on my own label and start my own business. I haven't made, I do all the analysis, but when I've made the big decisions, it hasn't been the logical choice. So, well, where should I go to school? What should I study? Okay, I'm graduating from university. What job should I take? I looked at all of those in an analytical way, but never did I make the logical choice, as analytical as I am. And that really had stuck with me before this came up. And then I thought about this decision. I thought, well, here's another example. Here I go again. I'm choosing the path that leads off into the trees here, and I'm not sure exactly where it's going, but I am taking this decision because I think when I get to the other side of the forest, I'll have a lot more opportunity than if I went down to the end of the street and turned left and took that job, or went to this place, or moved there, or studied that. And sure enough, it has been another great part of my randonnée in life, my adventure. So I don't know, that's kind of our story. I think it's something that everyone can relate to in their own way, which is great. I'm happy that people can do that. We all have our own journey in life.
Absolutely. So I have a couple more questions about the Randonnée, but let's back up for a second. Let's talk about Ireland. How did you end up in Ireland?
My previous job as an engineer had opportunities to work as an expat abroad, and my friend John Morgan, who was my first boss and a great mentor in that career when I first moved to Oregon, he had taken his family 3 separate occasions and moved them overseas for assignments as an engineer working for, I guess, 2 different companies. And just to hear the stories that he told and how big an impression it made on him personally and on his wife, Bridget, I'm sure we'll learn in the years ahead like what the impact was on their kids, but it just like the richness that it brought to his life and the stories he could tell and how much fun it was to get to know another culture and make friends there and really kind of learn about what made people tick somewhere else. It like really stuck with me. So I had started looking around for opportunities to work abroad with the company as an expat, and lo and behold, in fact, I house sat for them actually. They moved to Israel for a year, and so I got to house sit for them and heard lots more stories at that point. And then they came back for a year, and then they were on Ireland, and he was like, hey, I need another engineer. I can't hire anybody. The economy's too great, and I need someone with experience that can come in and boom, immediately get to work on this project. I've talked to a few other people, but you're maybe the only one that's able to come right now. And I said, sure, let's do it. And so I got to live in Ireland. So I was there for 3 years. It was meant to be 18 months, maybe a year. Then it was 2, then it was 2.5, then it was 3. And at that point, I was like, okay, this is great, but I think I want to go home now and see where this is going to take me. And so that was the time in Ireland. You're probably wondering, well, how did I meet Clodagh? And okay, so a friend that I knew, I met my freshman year in college, had studied in Copenhagen, had dated a guy there who knew someone in Ireland, who had a friend that worked in Intel, who had another friend who was in a hill walking club. So I had lunch with the friend of the friend of the friend one day at work, and she said, yeah, you should, contact this person and find out about their hill walking club, and maybe you can join up since that's what you like to do, right? Because I'd kind of put it out there. I want to spend some time outdoors and hike and camp and backpack and do whatever I can do with my free time. And so I went along to this hill walking club called the Bootleggers and met Clodagh through that. So it's that it's brilliant. I love the way that the story works, but it's the people and the relationships again. It's the friends who know someone and gosh, you're looking for this, or you're looking for that, or you like to do this. I think I know someone. Maybe they can help. And that's another part of the Randonnée.
And your willingness to say yes and try it.
Sure. Yeah, maybe not every time, but generally, yes.
So, I'm curious, as you're working at Apolloni, you have La Randonnée started. You're also working with Custom Crush, as you mentioned. I'm curious about, as you're handling that many different winemaking kind of tasks or winemaking, how are things separated? How are you making your wines unique from Apolloni and Custom Crush unique from each other? And how do you kind of manage the different kinds of winemaking styles all going on at the same time?
Good question. Going back to my philosophy, I think in many respects, or the majority of the winemaking, I don't have to worry about it because the sites, the vineyards, the terroir speaks for itself. So if I was making David Polite's wines from Carlton Hill, I'd have to think a little bit more carefully about that to make sure that they were different from La Randonnée, or more distinct, let's say. But as it is, my Custom Crush clients have vineyards kind of around the valley, and I source my fruit from Yamhill Carlton, different vineyard in the Yamhill Carlton, other folks here in the Tualatin Valley. So majority don't have to worry about it because of the site speaking differently. And then it's trying to make the wine in a style that appeals to each person and their palate. And I think once I start thinking about that, well, then I'm making different decisions already that will differentiate the wines. And I've experimented a lot here at Apolloni with techniques that I use with La Randonnée and techniques that I learned elsewhere to try and see what fits, or diversify what we have to work with when it comes time for blending. So when making a big volume like Apolloni, I can do a little bit of everything, I guess you'd say, because it's possible that this one technique or this one ferment could become a single bottling, but it's most likely going to be a few different fermentations that had a few different techniques, or were picked at a little bit different time. Maybe they had a whole cluster, maybe they didn't. Maybe they were aged in new wood or neutral, and so that all becomes part of the blend and the interesting, making the wines more interesting and hopefully better. So I guess it's site, going back to that again, and then as we talked about, what is the style that someone is after? And once I start working with fruit from their site and thinking about their style, that wine's going to wind up different. For La Randonnée, going back to Domaine Lejeune, I do a more significant portion of the whole cluster, and we make a tiny amount of wine. I mean, Claude and I maximum have made a couple hundred cases in a year. But it's really 3 barrels of Pinot, it has been, from Carlton Hill every vintage, and maybe 60 to 90 cases of Sauvignon Blanc. So it's been super small. And just to close out that discussion, it's the starting the business was the easy decision. The getting the business set up and actually figuring out how to do it has been incredibly difficult, because as I mentioned, it's a bunch of things that I know nothing about. I wish I would have taken accounting in college, but man, I was too busy doing economics and 2 different kinds of engineering and some environmental courses, and it was just, unfortunately, it didn't ever get fit in, but man, that would have been helpful. Or a marketing class, or a business class, or how about some class on taxes? I mean, these things are, and we've all had to do it in the industry, like learn these things or learn the other side of the business if that's our background is more suited to that kind of stuff. So I mean, people have asked me, would you start a business again? Do you like owning your own business? And the answer is, I do really like owning my own business, and I would do it again. It's easily 10 times more work than I thought it was going to be, but I've learned more about sort of the way the world works or the way business works in a small amount of time than anything else in my career. So I wish everyone could own their own business at some point in their lives, or work directly for someone in a small business to really learn that, and preferably early in one's career, because that knowledge is it's just super helpful.
Tell me about selling wine. You're selling wine, obviously, with Apolloni. You're obviously selling your own wine. What are the challenges when it comes to selling wine, especially now when it is actually your name on the label, or your label?
Well, I thought that it would be my least favorite part of the whole business. To be honest about it, would be the selling the wine. I probably hadn't done my own brand earlier or pushed harder because of that. Did I turn off a mic? So I guess I had heard lots of stories about how difficult it was to go to other markets and sell in distribution. But I hadn't heard so many stories about the talking directly to the consumer. And I don't know if I learned it in Ireland or if there was always some part of me that was a real social person and likes to talk. I mean, part of my heritage, as a lot of other people, is Irish. So I love talking to people about wine. I love hearing their stories about wine, what they like, what got them interested in it, how they came to show up at a tasting and hear about us, or like Pinot Noir, what do they think of Sauvignon Blanc, all these kinds of things. And so it's actually turned out to be a lot of fun for me, and I didn't expect that to be. And even again, because we're so small, I don't have a distributor in another state and have to be on the phone with them or make market trips or do those sorts of things for Randonnée. So maybe I haven't seen the more difficult side of the business. We self-distribute in Oregon, and so I've been fortunate to make friends and acquaintances with people who work in bars or restaurants, and hopefully they'll all come out of COVID successfully, and we'll be back on their wine lists or back on their shelves. And basically it's just meeting people, and if they like our wine, which comes from a very specific site that speaks to me, then I think we're going to have a good relationship. It's just a matter of finding those fits.
You bring up COVID. Obviously, we're talking to you in the midst of COVID. Tell me about how it's affected your work, and sort of maybe how it's affected, how you're looking ahead, how it's affecting your kind of view of the future. Because it changes every day, it's kind of hard to say what I or anyone else, I think, in the industry thinks of the future. And I think when it first sort of broke and happened, or was happening, and we were approaching shutdown time, here at Apolloni, I think we were in a fortunate place because we were just finishing our first big bottling of the year. This is in the middle of March, and my cellar master, Morgan, was headed off to New Zealand a couple days later to work vintage down there. So I think fortunately for her, unfortunately for us, the timing worked out well, because then, of course, once the tasting room closed and we're trying to look at our decreasing revenue and the work that needed to be done, then it was a great opportunity to have just a few of us at the winery doing the work and put off our next bottling till a little bit later, and for me to try and keep up, with the things that had to be done on any given day. So that's a big challenge because the wine can't wait. So fortunately here in Oregon we were able to keep working, and there were usually just me on my own in the winery in a given day, just trying to keep up with whatever had to be done for a few months. And
basically to make sure the wines continued to improve in barrel and that I was making some progress towards getting ready for the next bottling. Knowing that I couldn't get fully ready until I had some help back, so then we had to wait for things to open up, both from the bottling truck standpoint and the labor standpoint, and we're able to get our next bottling done in June. So I think from that perspective, from a production perspective, it all worked out. From a vineyard perspective, the vines don't care about COVID. This is true everywhere in the valley, and I mean, just it's the way it is. So grapes are growing, trees are growing, everything's just happening as if, just the same as it always would. It's really the sales side that's the biggest question mark, and I think at Apolloni we have done a great job. We had our wine club for the shipping proportion happening around this time, and so that was kind of a lifeline to keep things rolling. And then with the various loan programs available, so we're in reasonable shape going forward. For the Randonnée, it, I guess, fortunately, is not all of my income. It's not my only job. I haven't decided to grow this into a business that supports Claude and I fully. So, the shutdown happened just as we were about to do our two biggest events for the year, which were obviously tasting events that would have drawn hundreds of people. So they didn't happen. We still have some very supportive wine club members, and they've helped us along. And the wine won't go off in a year, and it should be fine in 2 years. So I feel like, what can I do? Instead of fighting it, I'm just, we're doing what we can do, and we'll probably we will make a little bit less wine this year. I think, unfortunately for our grower friends, that's the decision that has to be made. But hopefully not everyone is making that decision, and I know it's going to be a difficult time for growers this year from that perspective.
What about go ahead, sorry.
Well, I mean, the other thing that's on my mind, in terms of COVID, is harvest.
My next question, so perfect.
Yeah. And it's, as an industry, we've been having regular calls and conversations and trying to come up with some kind of baseline approved ways of working in close proximity or not, or how to do the things that require us to be close to one another during harvest in a safe manner. So hopefully we'll get some clarification on that in the next few weeks, and then it's just a question of implementing that and anything else we feel is necessary at the winery. And asking, I think the most difficult thing for all of us during harvest is going to be asking our harvest interns in particular. Regular employees, maybe it's a little easier, but asking harvest interns to do the best thing for their co-workers during harvest and the business that they're working for, and not see other people. Basically form a small pod, stay in a house with some harvest interns, maybe just from your winery or maybe from a couple of wineries, but no one else, and not going out and about and more socializing than that. I think that is what will make the harvest as successful as it can be anywhere in the world, and especially in Oregon, because we have a lot of small brands and small teams, and if a team goes down, then that business is in trouble. It's not just the wine, it's potentially that business. So that those thoughts are weighing on me a bit, and kind of exactly what the plan is going to be. And then, like a lot of other wineries, we were expecting to have an international intern this year. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I haven't shut the door, kind of waiting to hear. Embassies haven't been open, visas haven't been being processed. I'm not sure that someone would necessarily want to come to the United States, although we're in pretty good shape in Oregon at the moment. I mean, relative to other states, not good shape, mind you, but better. So it's finding local people to fill in when we or other wineries can't get an international intern that we'd planned on having.
Yeah, the saddest part, the ironic part is that, like you talked about, so many people, the social part of it is such a big part of the industry, and to take that away is such a huge blow to people who want to be in the industry. It's such a bitter irony.
Although it can be equally social. It's just going to be a smaller group. So there's less opportunity for an intern to network with other people and meet maybe as many people from around the world or around the country, or encounter as many brands and winemaking styles. But maybe this is a gift, or maybe it's an opportunity in a different way, that then the bonds that we make within a small team at a winery are that much stronger, and that carries us into the future in a different way.
Tell me about how the Oregon wine industry has changed since you've been in it. What are the biggest changes you've noticed as a part of the industry from when you entered to what it looks like now?
I think it's changed a tremendous amount. I kind of wonder, I've been in the industry now for 15 years, not an insignificant amount of time. But I wonder how, if you could ask someone without their knowledge, someone who's been in the industry since its inception or longer, without the knowledge of the previous 10 or 15 years, how much do they feel it's changed in the last 10 or 15 compared to the previous 10 or 15? I wonder, but we didn't have big brands in Oregon when I started. We didn't have investors from other parts of the country. Okay, TDO was here, and maybe there were a couple other French investments, but for the most part, it was small brands in Oregon, and I think that's been the biggest change. So I think that's been the biggest change, and I don't know if it's ultimately good or bad or no different. It feels, I think, for a lot of people like it's maybe bad or less desirable, let's say, because it's changing or has changed the character of the industry a bit. I think we're still collaborative, but it's not as collaborative as it maybe was before, and I just hope that we can maintain that, because that's a big part of what really drew me into the industry, was the collaborative nature of working together. So here he's coming back with the mower.
So you talk about collaboration, and that's obviously a big, like you say, a big part you got into the industry, but you're seeing it change.
I'm just seeing the makeup of the industry change a lot. I think the collaboration has changed some, and although it is still very collaborative, a lot of the inputs come more from bigger brands or from the multiple sites of big brands, because they send a person or two from each site that's on the winemaking team and the marketing team and what have you. And I think that, I'm not saying it's bad or good, I wonder. I see that as a big difference now. So the Oregon Wine Symposium is a great event. I love going to it every year to sort of get my head back up to the 30,000 foot level in terms of thinking about winemaking and viticulture, and marketing and sales to a much lesser degree. And it's changed a lot. I just say, from when we were in Salem at the convention center there to being at the convention center in Portland, it's no less valuable, but it has changed a lot, and I'm just kind of wondering how does this go forward.
Well, let's ask about that. What do you see as you look ahead for Oregon wine? What is the industry going to look like in the coming years?
Well, COVID throws a big kind of question mark or uncertainty over any of that. I mean, if you'd asked me, even at the beginning of this year, beginning of this year, for the Randonnée, this would have been our biggest sales year yet. We've grown our sales each of the years that we have been selling, which, as I said, is since 16. And we made more wine with the 19 vintage than we had in any previous vintage. So unfortunately, we won't sell like I thought we were going to. We'll have a little bit more wine to carry over, but as I said, it's not wines. We're lucky, I guess. We're not a farmer growing for a farmer's market. The wine will hold. It's not forever, but it'll be okay. It might even be better next year. So that's sort of where I was at with the Randonnée thinking, and that applies to how I saw the Oregon wine industry going. I mean, I think wine tourism is still a huge deal for Oregon, or was, and again, you have this COVID question mark. But I saw the number of brands increasing, the amount of wine being produced, more people being aware of Oregon wine nationwide, worldwide. When we were on holidays in Ireland last year, I made it a point to take some Oregon wines with me and set up an appointment at a couple of wine shops in Dublin that we were friendly with, and just say, hey, here's Oregon, ask me questions. I'm here to be a brand ambassador. I mean, no one asked me to do this, but I felt like it's a great opportunity for me to help brand Oregon and make some connections or work my connections in Ireland to make more people aware of us. And I think that all that potential is still there. And I think as long as people keep consuming wine, or maybe that continues to increase in the way that it has been recently, then I think all of that potential is still there and will be bigger and better individually and as an industry here in Oregon in a few years. It's just not going to happen this year. I don't think it probably won't happen next year. And so how does the Oregon wine industry look in a few years? Well, how many years out are we talking? And hopefully we will have few issues with attrition as a result of COVID. That's certainly a worry, and especially in the hospitality industry, because we, to one degree or another, depend on bars and restaurants to sell our wares and introduce individual brands as well as brand Oregon to a lot of people. And we were very successful with that as an industry, and we will be again, but maybe there will be fewer restaurants. I guess there will be. So that's the biggest worry in my mind for the industry as a whole. Because, I mean, you kind of chuckle, with COVID, I think the media has talked up how much more people are drinking and how wine sales went through the roof for the first month. And for some brands, I'm sure that's true, but the nature of this pandemic favored a certain distribution model, a certain business model, and that favors bigger producers. So it's more of a corporate model for the most part. So it favors bigger corporations, and unfortunately, that's not the majority of Oregon.
So what about as you look ahead for yourself and for your Randonnée and for Apolloni? What do you kind of see as you look ahead for them? Obviously, same caveat applies with COVID, but what are you kind of hoping for in terms of growth and change?
Well, I think for Apolloni, we, as I think with most brands, have been just kind of saying, okay, well, how is phase one working for us? How can we, or do we need to change our model to make it more successful for us? How reliable is the wine club? How can we give the wine club the same value that we have given them in the past, or that they feel like they're getting the same value? So I think we're all kind of navigating those things, and we will have to adapt over the next year, and that's going to take all of us, I think, working a little bit more diligently on different sides, all sides of the business, to make that a success. So I don't really have a good answer for you. It's just that we're all trying to adapt at the moment. For the Randonnée, as I said, I'm going to make a little bit less wine this year. I'm sure it'll be just as good. I'm sure that when people have the opportunity to try it, they'll be just as happy with it. But I feel like we need to focus, Clodagh and I, on our wine club members, and by shrinking production and making that a little bit more in line with our regular customers, it will hopefully make our job a little bit easier too. And that's, I don't know, I think a lot of people are doing some soul searching during COVID, and I have done that too, and thought a lot about how much time I spend having a business as well as a day job, so to speak, or side hustle in addition to my day job, and it's a lot. I'd like it to be a little bit less.
With all this said, your interviews kind of captured a lot of different sides of what it's like being in the Oregon wine industry, the kind of the good and the bad and the question mark. You talked earlier kind of about if someone were getting into the industry, what your advice would be for them would be. All this said, what would you tell someone if they came to you tomorrow and said they wanted to get into Oregon wine?
I guess it depends where they are at in their life or their career at the moment. I mean, I can speak very I have a lot of experience with a career change into the wine industry, so I would have no problem chatting with somebody about that and saying, well, here's how difficult it's going to be. Or here are the different avenues into the wine industry. You can invest and start a brand. You can want to become a worker in this part of the industry or this part of the industry, this part of the industry. So what would I say? I just be prepared for it to be a long road and much less financially rewarding, at least initially, than probably most any career if you're changing out of it. However, it has all of these other rewards. You know, the culture, even in the United States, which doesn't have the same depth or maybe breadth of culture of food and wine that most European countries do, or many European countries do, even so, we have this great food and wine culture, and it's a tremendous amount of fun to be part of. And it's, you know, I talked about the whole Kevin and wanting to change my career to put all of my faculties to work, and the biggest change in that area was really developing my sense of smell. And I think we all as humans have this amazing sense of smell, but it's not very well practiced. So that is sort of an example or metaphor for, sure, if you want to change your career into the Oregon wine into the wine industry, it's like a new awakening in some respects. Not only, you know, physically from a sensory standpoint, but all these other food and wine, learning more about the small business, it's like this renaissance, great awakening has happened in the middle of my life, in the middle of my career. So I feel very fortunate to do that, but as we talked about, it's a bit of a road to get to that point. Now, on the other hand, if someone was saying, well, I want to get into the wine industry and this is my first career, or I've just finished college, or I'm thinking about going to college, what should I study? Maybe it's a little bit easier to get started at that point, because I think we'd all expect to work our way up from whatever new career we start, and if we haven't already started one, that's no bother. So, yeah.
Sure.
I'm not sure I really answered the question, because to me it's, or maybe there isn't an easy answer to the question. To me, it's more having a conversation. It's back to that social part of the industry and the more social part of Kevin that I've discovered being here.
I think be prepared to work hard is also probably, the way you started is probably pretty good advice.
Absolutely. That kind of goes, that's part of my nature. I mean, Claude will tell you, I rarely sit still. I'm always busy doing something. So yeah, I fully expect to always be in motion and doing something in the wine industry, at least the production side.
So that's all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here that we should have covered?
I mean, I didn't really come with a list of things I wanted to talk about or a particular agenda. So, I mean, I feel like I've gotten to talk about a lot of my experience in life and in the Oregon wine industry.
Good.
So I appreciate the questions that got us there, and I really do feel lucky to be living in Oregon. It's a special place because we have this amazing set of values around our land that really enables us as wine growers to farm in the way we do close to the cities, because the city is where the people live, and outside of those boundaries is where the agriculture is. And coming from Colorado and seeing that lack of land use planning and more of the sprawl mentality that grips most of the country, I feel very, very fortunate to be here from that perspective, and because the industry has been a lot of fun. I think the majority of the people are really genuinely, we want to be here in Oregon, we want to be in the wine industry, we want to help one another, and I feel fortunate to be a part of that. And,
Excellent.
you know, I've gotten the opportunity to work with a number of great people.
Excellent. That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your stories with us and dealing with a little bit of technical difficulty there in the middle. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.